I think we've probably, in the last couple of generations, messed an awful lot up. There's much less for the pollinators and the wider flora and fauna, and we need to create room for that. And there's no reason why we can't create room for that in our pastures.
Welcome to the next episode of ReGen Ag Chat with me, Liz Genever.
And me, Nic Renison.
So on this episode, we're going to be talking to Francis Dunne. But before we move on to him, we'll just have a quick catch up. So, Nic, what have you been up to?
Liz, we're in the same room with your bitey dog between us. Slightly worried.
She's protecting me from you, understandable.
So you're here to do a few meetings and have a bit of a carbon calling catch up. But what have I been up to? Well, Groundswell a few weeks ago. Loved it.
I was a bit angry, but we'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay. Well, I did love it, but I bloody hate camping. We're just awful campers. My highlight, I didn't get to a huge number of sessions. I've caught up on some on YouTube since, but my favourite person was this German chap called Benedict Bosel. He was really gorgeous as well. And he set up, he was an investment banker, went home to his farm estate, which sounds very privileged, but I think it was in a bit of a pickle. And he just has done loads of stuff there, worked with the community, set up a foundation, and his chat was just amazing. The other thing I've done is had a weekend at Patrick Holden, who's one of my heroes, farms down in the middle of Wales, and it was the most beautiful place. And it was all to do with the Beacon Farm initiative that the Sustainable Food Trust are doing, along with the Harmony Foundation, and met loads of really interesting people and came back again camping, awful, but completely reinvigorated from that weekend. Anyway.
Do you think you need to buy a tent box or something?
Yeah, I need to buy a tent box, but I'm not sure a tent box fits on a Skoda.
Well,
I was next to Claire Whittle, who was in her tent box, very happy. And I'd forgotten my tent was still not with me since Groundswell, and she lent me a tent, and then it rained. And I woke up in a little island surrounded by water. Oh, God, I hated it. Anyway, it didn't tarnish anything. I just don't like camping. Anyway, that's enough of camping.
And to clarify, my anger wasn't at Groundswell, and it was more frustration of some of the greenwashing, we're going to call it, in a polite way, but of some of the people you see there that I'm not sure are true believers, but they're now marketing to farmers who want to make changes. So it gets a bit frustrating. To clarify, it wasn't anger at Groundswell. And then I'm making a concerted effort to do more on Instagram, so that and then I've done loads of events and all various things. So, but you can catch up on that. So that's Liz Genever, and I've also been listening to the Will Harris book, which is about his white oak pastures, which was very interesting. So I'm recommending that to lots of people as well. I just, in terms of understanding there can be quite a lot of pain in terms of trying to develop these food systems. So it's just quite interesting.
But the other book you mentioned is Atomic Habits, which I'm halfway through, which isn't to do with farming particularly, is it? It's not to do with farming at all.
No.
It's just creating good habits.
Which is part of the reason my challenge is to this one Instagram post a day, which has come from that book. I'm also meant to be doing the tree pose when I'm brushing my teeth, but that's not very often.
And it goes back to poor old Michael Mosley and just one thing. I do have a cold shower most days.
Rest in peace, Michael.
Yeah. Anyway, our speaker today, Liz, our interview person.
No, just before we go into that, we have to recognise that carbon calling is coming to us very, very soon. So yeah, plans are generally in place. We just now need people to come along. We've got decent number of people coming, but we can always have some more. So if you're interested, go to the website, which is carboncalling.farm, and there's a link to the ticket, and also the final program is also up.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, and different from the previous. So if you've been to previous ones and go, oh, it's going to be the same, it is certainly not. So it's worth having a look at the program.
And you can even have an ice cream at lunchtime from Trapenda Ice Cream.
Three Hills. So yeah.
Three Hills, yeah.
No, and yeah, sorry, Francis, the other thing just to clarify before we hand over to Francis is we use some acronyms within it, which is the GS4, which is a diverse lay within the mid-tier countryside stewardship, which is an England environmental scheme. And we also occasionally use the word SAM3, which is a diverse lay, but within the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is also an English environmental scheme. So just to clarify them before you listen to our chat with Francis,
which was very enjoyable, and he's such a lovely communicator, and we both
and he was a podcast virgin.
He was a podcast virgin. No longer, Francis. you have cracked it with us, which is highly enjoyable.
Apologise as ever. We'll hand over to Francis. Bye for now.
So, Liz, today we have Francis Dunne joining us. Thank you, Francis. Lovely to see you up in Scotland currently. The idea for this podcast came about when Reno, my husband, was on the phone to you ordering some herbal ley seeds. And we've done a bit of herbal laying in the past. And it was conversation you had with Reno about putting herbal leys in and how complex it can be, and how the current schemes are opening up a huge array of questions, and your answers were particularly interesting. So,
okay.
So can we're going to go on to that. But first of all, Francis, could you tell us a little bit about you and where you've come from?
Right. I'm a grass and forage seed specialist based in the Welsh borders. I do work all over the country with farmers who are interested in the same areas of sort of pasture development as I am. I was the founder and managing director of Field Options until I left them about 18 months ago, having sold the business to one of the national companies, and wanted to get back to farm level and to my areas of speciality. So I'm an independent grass and forage seed business, basically.
But if we go back a little bit further, I want to go back further, Francis.
Okay.
Not a tiny thing, but like a younger thing than you are now.
Okay, younger thing than I am now. I went to the Welsh Agricultural College where I did an HND. I then travelled the world for a couple of years, came back to the UK, worked on farms for a couple of years, and then joined the seed company that was then Sinclair McGill, an independent seed company based in Boston in Lincolnshire. Within a few months of being there, we sold seeds of every sort, from flowers to grass to arable seeds. I became more interested in the seeds associated with livestock farming because that was an area where there seemed to be so much potential for improvement and development in what was going on, sort of treating grass as a crop. And since then they got taken over by ICI. They shut down that business, sold it on to someone else. I then worked for Oliver Seeds for a number of years, developing that business with the team there. And then when they were taken over by a plant breeding company, I set up Field Options as an independent and unaligned business away from the influence directly of plant breeders.
Okay.
It's not that you don't like research, it's just the fact is you like being able to use the best grasses.
Yes, exactly. No, it's not absolutely. I like the freedom to be able to deal with all the plant breeders that are out there, and they've all got strengths and weaknesses, but I just want the strengths, and that is, it's easier said than done, but I've never been very good at being told what to do. So that is one of the reasons for independence as well.
And when you say plant breeders,
mm-hmm.
Can you just talk a little bit? I have got no idea. Liz will. I've got no idea about who grows these seeds. Is it in this country? Is it overseas?
I would say a very large amount of the seed that is used in grass mixtures, so grasses, clovers, herbs, a great deal of it is grown in other countries where the climate is more conducive to harvesting small seeds. So that may be all parts of Europe, and in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly in New Zealand, which has a very well developed seed industry, but they may come from North America and other places. A number of species, particularly things like perennial ryegrass, are mostly produced in the UK. So the UK is a major seed producer and exports seed as well. And we produce seeds profitably or effectively that we're most efficient at growing. So some species are just not easy to grow in our climate, and therefore it's a totally international business with some big areas of focus in countries like Denmark, Germany, France, Washington and Oregon in the States, South Island of New Zealand.
But that's to the multiplier stage, isn't it? So prior to that, you have got some people in some greenhouses cutting bits.
Absolutely,
testing stuff.
Yeah, a significant amount of breeding goes on in Northern Europe, and in Britain there are breeding programs with Barenbrug and with Aberystwyth and DSV, and I'm sure there's a number of others, like DLF. And in Ireland, the Irish plant breeding program is fairly progressive as well in terms of perennial ryegrasses and clovers. So there's a fair amount of breeding activity, but the multiplication is often overseas.
And it's the fact is that it was always the adage, wasn't it? It's 12 years from where an interesting plant may have been developed into actually possibly getting it into a bag on an old farm.
That is correct. I think those processes are shortening with the various genetic technology that's about, but it is, I mean, just to get a variety on the grass recommended list takes 6 years. So is it 6 years? It's 2 years of 3 trials so it's certainly 5 years just to get on the UK recommended list. So there's a number of years prior to that is obviously a significant development period.
And because of the risk of that, they might not get onto the recommended list, so they might be on the list, and then there's not enough seed for anybody to buy for a year or two.
Absolutely.
So and so that, I suppose, is the frustration of when we now need something that is now water tolerant. It's like, well, it needs to now be thought about 12 years ago. Well, that's where we use different species.
I think it's where we use different species. I think fundamentally we've still got with the material we've got available now, we're probably not utilizing its potential already. And there are characteristics that we probably need to breed for that gives the breeders direction, like crown rust resistance and things. But we do have other species. We're slightly hamstrung by Brexit in that there's a number of varieties from across the Channel, particularly, where and species that we wouldn't normally be thinking about if the climate wasn't quite as unstable as it appears to be now. The French have been breeding some very interesting tall fescue and cocksfoot in recent years. That last year when I was down in New Zealand, it wasn't new technology from New Zealand I was witnessing. It was new technology from France that was, particularly in their drier areas, that was of particular interest. Now, some of that is available in the UK, but because we haven't necessarily tested it, it's not national listed in the UK. Pre-Brexit, we could import anything that was national listed in any European country. Now we actually have to test it all over again. So there is technology that does exist now that we probably not in a position to use for 5 years, purely because we've not got a reciprocal agreement with Europe. It's our rules that are the problem, not European rules. So it's frustrating, but the reality is most things are. There's a lot of stuff that is already available. And we need to learn how to maybe use it and incorporate it. We're very used to managing perennial ryegrass and white clover. To manage some of these other species, you have to, manage them grazing intervals in different, shorter grazing intervals at certain times in the year, that type of thing. But you need to adapt a little bit to exploit the enormous potential of some of them.
I've just got a question for Nick. Sorry to interrupt, Francis. Is the technology breeding improvement starting, because it does unsettle some sort of regenerative type of people, that's particularly a talk of perennial ryegrass is seen as evil. Yeah. And also we've talked about breeding programs and we've talked about the use of technology, which if you, some people in a regenerative approach the backlash is against all of that. So I'm just, what are your thoughts, Nick?
In the current situation here, our permanent pastures this year have been much easier to manage than our herbal leys, partly because of how we've been seeding things and grazing things lower. But the very sciencey techno chat does slightly worry me. Sorry, Francis. Because I just all I know is that our permanent pasture, it might not be as productive, but the stock they do seem to enjoy it better, and you'll put them into a herbal ley field, and they'll go to the outside. So I do have questions about it, even though we have done herbal leys for quite a few years now, and they've been really successful to us. But there are questions around the tech, the science.
I'm not particularly worried about that because there's nothing technical that we're doing in breeding of grass and forage crops that's not. It's sort of it's all conventional selection from material that already exists. The things that's speeding up plant breeding is just profiling the genetics that you're breeding with, and then being able to analyze tissue from initial seedlings to be able to know what you've got before you have to put it in a field. So does it have the traits you're looking for? The gene markers have been explored in the last couple of decades, and and so that's what's speeding it up. There's nothing. There's nothing.
GM.
Yeah, there was definitely no GM. No, and gene editing is still, it's a long way from pasture stuff. That's for sure.
But on the palatability front,
yeah.
why is it that the livestock prefer the edge of the field that hasn't been that isn't a new ley?
I think it depends on, it may reflect on what you've sown and whether I've supplied it. It's
because that often happens, doesn't it? You hear that quite often, don't you, Liz? That they go and seek out the older leys, and
it is fair, Francis, that within plant breeding, palatability isn't often tested for. So there will be genetic variation within that, or preferences for grass, but it's a very expensive part of a plant breeding program.
It's been included quite often, although people working out what palatability is, what affects palatability. I remember I used to have a connection with a breeder in France who was quite creative. It was a company called Carnot, which is now part of Semences de France and part of a bigger organization now. But his varieties are still out there, or some of them only just arrived. And he had been doing breeding perennial ryegrass and some other species in a location near Lille. And he had noticed that the hares in the field were choosing some plots over others. So he made them into a variety. It's a sort of observation that does happen. And actually the French trials, they used to graze them up until about 15 years ago. In the last year, they'd just put a mob of sheep in there and look at what they grazed and what they didn't. And they came up with a score on it. And I've done grazing trials over the years, and it is fascinating what they eat and what they don't eat. And I've been involved in that in the last 12 years, where we were testing for a New Zealand breeder in North Herefordshire, and we had 200 odd plots, and we would measure the cover the day before they went into the field, the cows, spring block calving, 21-day type rotation system. And then we would measure the residuals, which was a way of measuring the palatability of it, or the preferential grazing, technically we call it. And because the cows were used to the whole system, you could stand in the plots when they came out after milking to go into that paddock and just observe what they were doing. And I'd absolutely say that some of the high-tech stuff that's top of the recommended list wasn't necessarily the first thing to be grazed. And actually, they probably, if you sort of summarized it by species, they grazed meadow fescue before perennial ryegrass. So I've always included some of that knowledge, and certainly my cocksfoot selection is based on that knowledge. So it is something that, and it slightly relates to the leafiness of the pasture, but not exclusively. But I also think that when it comes down to it, the principle is we need yield, we need utilization, and we need nutritional quality, and that doesn't include just energy and protein, but range of minerals as well. And you do find animals being selective, and I've often seen them grazing the edge of the field before very simple, particularly things like Italian ryegrass. And they are looking for minerals that they're not getting from whatever they've got grazing in the field. And I think by providing a degree of diversity in the pasture, you will potentially get, each species pulls up a different range of minerals. You're limited by the geology of those of where you are. You know, if you're in a low selenium area, you're not going to get much selenium, whatever the species. But you are influencing the background nutrition a little bit that, you know, that helps support what you're trying to do.
I suppose there's the range of permanent pastures, but some of those herbal ley diverse mixtures are trying to replicate some of those amazingly diverse permanent pastures. But equally, we can walk into fields of very poor permanent pasture that's not doing a job either.
Absolutely shocking, yeah. There's good permanent pasture and there's poor permanent pasture. I was, you know, thinking about it as I was driving up to Scotland the other day and past some sort of fields of what looked like 90% Yorkshire fog. Well, you know, it might have minerals in it, I don't know, but nothing eats it. So it's not good pasture. And we can make a modern mixture that's not very good. And the current, I mean, I don't tend to use the expression herbal leys. Diverse pasture, yes, and they may have herbs within it. But I see that, you know, the two core herbs that we often see and talk about of chicory and plantain. I mean, plantain, yes, exists in our natural pastures, and the narrow-leaf plantain probably less than the broader-leaf plantain. But it's by its nature, they're biennial species. They're not long-term species in a long-term pasture. Things like yarrow are, and that may or may not be right for anyone's particular system. But I tend to use, you know, the grasses and the legumes, as far as I'm concerned, drive the system. And I'm one of the people who doesn't think perennial ryegrass is bad. It just needs complementary species. You know, it's got some amazing benefits, but it has a relatively short growing season. It's not very good in a drought. But there are other species you can grow with it that allow you to get the best of both worlds. And there are some things we put in herbal leys which, they're probably completely pointless on some soils. So, I'm a bit sort of fussy about stuff like that. You can spend a lot of money planting things that are of no benefit to you at all.
Such as?
Well, you know, on the stronger and more fertile soils, things like parsley and burnet don't really stand a chance, as often things like some of the legumes like trefoils. But if you're on chalk or limestone, in relatively hungry situations, they might be contributing a certain amount and be useful. But fertile lowland, medium soils, the other species are incredibly competitive, and they basically drown them out. I don't know what your experience is, Nick, on that sort of thing.
We had, I don't know if it was one of your mixes, but sandfoin, is that how you say it?
Yeah.
That was something we saw in the first year and then got very excited about it because it's a beautiful plant, and then never to be seen again.
Very much naturalized to high pH, free draining soils. So primarily limestone, but it grows on the limestone and the chalk, but it doesn't really, and it likes a very high pH. It's a very interesting species, but it's not relevant in in many areas of the country.
And that was part of the conversation you and Reno had about getting our new herbal ley seeds and just using, because we've tried some in the past that haven't worked. We settled for the ones that we definitely know will work.
Yeah, and then look at other things. Yeah, I more than 20 years ago, I started. We used to essentially supply farmers with a blend of herbs if they were interested in adding herbs to their pasture. And I made a habit of going back and looking at fields 2 years later to see what was there. And sometimes the answer was none of it. There was invariably, in most situations, yarrow and plantain. But if I went back 4 years later, there might not be any plantain either. So I think that was a sort of initial thing that opened my eyes to this problem. Put in a mixture, what is going to survive? Because if you create a gap with something dying out, invariably what colonizes that gap isn't necessarily what you want. There is a significant change, though, in that over the last 25 years, 30 years, we've gone much more from set stocking or rotational set stocking to proper rotational grazing. And rotational grazing is absolutely key to adopting some of these species because they need a defoliation and rest. And that allows them to, build their solar panels and complementary build their rooting systems. So if people are, going down the SAM3 SFI option of herbal leys, they need to, if they're not already rotationally grazing, they need to adapt their grazing to that system to suit the species that they're sowing, and also keep off them during the winter, which, if you say that to 50% of farmers in the UK, keep off those fields during the winter, it's something that does make them stop and think. And because, there was a big enthusiasm when new red clover technology came out a few years ago, and they were more persistent. So, half of Wales was sown with red clover, it seemed, or everybody was reseeding with red clover in their mixtures. 12 months later, they couldn't find any. And it was because of how those fields were managed. Didn't say that the red clover was wrong. You just need to, if you want red clover and you want to use it in your system and exploit its potential, you have to adapt your management.
And that, I suppose, is some of the frustration with the SFI, isn't it? Which is you've got a relatively good dollop of money incentivizing people to shift.
Yeah.
You've got a set of rules that can be quite happily interpreted. Let's put it in a positive way.
Yes.
You've got not a huge amount of management guidance that sits alongside that. So they very much wanted the rules to be quite open.
Yep.
And I suppose the positive all of that is it should be incentivizing people to try things, which then they could adapt into their future system. But nowhere does it, this idea of if you put your whole farm down to them, where the hell are you going to graze things in the winter?
Yeah.
So there's the support advice isn't being sought, and so the challenge is some of those decisions are being made, aren't they? And some of those leys aren't going to work.
An extraordinary amount of those leys aren't going to work. And I don't know where DEFRA and RPA have sort of got their advice from, but they could have done a simple and flexible system with slightly more defined boundaries in it that would help people in making decisions. I think the SFI benefits may be quite short term, and we need to plan for the future. And I think with SFI, farmers need to select options which complement the core business, and improving their. We know that there is diverse pasture technology that can be very productive. I mean, work I did in my previous job at Harper Adams, there was significant benefit to adding a bit of diversity into fairly conventional but technically good mixtures. We were getting 1 to 2 tons of dry matter per hectare improvement by adding the herbs and extra legumes to a pasture. And if you're in a position also to rotationally graze them and exploit that potential, growing diverse pastures is going to be good for the longevity of the future sustainability of a business. the clover was as important as anything. White clover bringing 1 to 1.5 tons of dry matter, red clover bringing up to 3 tons of dry matter in certain situations. But again, that's a short-lived, like chicory, it's a short-lived species within a pasture mixture. We're talking 2 to 3 years. So the SFI has an opportunity. It's allowing people to afford to try something a little bit different. But I don't advise people to move far away from what they were doing before unless they weren't even rotational grazing. And it can be as useful in a silage block as in a grazing block to have that diversity and legume dominance. I've got a customer down in Dorset who has a 2 spring calving herds and an autumn calving herd. He's got the GS4 option on his silage block of his autumn calving herd, and he's producing some very good yields of silage with good energy levels, good protein levels, without any fertilizer. It's lining himself up for a successful future. The same type of same stewardship option is on some of his spring block calving grazing area, and is working. But we're certainly moving away from using the same species in both mixtures. You work out the most important thing really is working out what someone wants to do with a field in the longer term, and select species that are most appropriate to the cutting or grazing management and what stock and that sort of thing.
And so I get this question quite often in terms of the chicory and silaging. Do you mean the concerns about chicory? So would you put any chicory in any ground that that's going to mainly be silaged?
If I know someone really well and I know they're on a sort of a 30-day cutting system, or they're just taking, we originally had in the GS4 option, you had to take 1 cut of silage. I would quite happily put chicory, happily is the wrong word. I wouldn't be worried too much about putting chicory in that situation, but I would guide them to, in the sort of GS4 type of situation, to shut it up on the 1st of May or whenever the opening period when you have to shut it up for 5 weeks, and then cut it, in that 30-day, at the end of that 30-day period, and it shouldn't be a problem. Thereafter, it becomes a problem, and so I do no chicory options on a number of my mixtures, and try and make up the numbers if it's driven by numbers, as far as the whatever environmental scheme that they may be signed up to. Because but the last thing I think about is, does the mix conform to SAM3? I work more often than not with fairly diverse pasture mixtures, and therefore it's all the other things are more important. The things that affect the performance in the field, where it is in the country, soil type, how they're wanting to use it. And then last, I say, does it conform to SAM3? It normally does anyway, but it might well not have chicory in it. My favorite really are plantain and yarrow, because I can understand how they fit in.
Just on the chicory, Liz, it's because it'll be spiky and go through the bales. Is that? It very quickly drops off in quality as it shoots to head at this time of year. And if you have your 5 or 6 weeks you've shut up to make some nice quality silage, and then it pours with rain for a fortnight, you're then stuck with something that's really quite difficult to handle. But essentially, that material is not worth putting in a bale. It costs the same to bale, to create a bale of nice stuff as nasty stuff. So why would you make nasty stuff?
and it's very much grazing orientated chicory, and then for people who are really into their grazing and got the infrastructure to do it. Again, when I was in Australia and New Zealand last year, they were mainly using these species as break crops, catch crops, not as part of perennial mixtures, plantain to a certain extent, but they weren't necessarily expecting it to last. And if they wanted to, they were drilling it in every 2 or 3 years.
Some of the more interesting ones on the lamb finishing side are sort of red clover, quite a lot of plantain, some white clover, minimum amount of grass, and they're there for 2 years. It's almost like thinking about it as a forage crop, but it might be in for 2 years. So a winter forage crop or a brassica type.
Absolutely.
And I suppose some of the frustration is the SFI or the rules that people are now following are not allowing us to play around with some of those really interesting mixes because they sometimes don't fulfill the rules.
Well, I do a certain amount with what I call multi-graze mixtures, which are sort of primarily designed for 12 months. They can be planted from the spring through to, say, mid-August, and they are a combination of grass, annual and perennial clovers, brassicas, and herbs, being used more as I was seeing them used in the Southern Hemisphere. I do always include grass. And I mean, our Italian ryegrasses don't head in the year of sowing. They stay vegetative for the first year. So they're actually incredibly good grazing and massive root systems on them. 18 months in, they're looking a bit sad and stalky, but there is a period of very useful productivity. And I think I have no worries about putting chicory in those mixtures, and a number of them are basically designed to be down for up to 12 months, so that they're normally part of a sort of a reseed plan whereby you're wanting to choose the moment at which you might reseed into them. But having grass keeps the sward density there, and I get less problems with things like thistles and dandelions if you filled in the bottom of the sward, so to speak, even though it's catch crop.
Now, I'm just thinking in terms of that, so that was starting to discuss overseeding. So there's a lot of people trying to establish herbs in particular and some clovers into overseeding. How can they make it work?
Well, it's not reliable. I think you'd indicated that this was an area you wanted to discuss, and my answer to your question that I wrote down, can overseeding really work? And I put sometimes. I think it works when it's carefully planned, but there is sometimes a limited productivity response. You can get, visual impact of something establishing, but not always realizing its potential. It's important to optimize pH and soil nutrients, and knowing your soil nutrient status. Too much fertility is as big a problem as too little. Some very fertile dairy land, it's very difficult to establish anything into. So consider that as a factor. But it seems to work better in slightly open pastures. So, a fairly worn out ley is a good candidate to consider. If you're in dense old turf with rough stalk meadowgrass and creeping bent and Yorkshire fog and things like that, it's almost a waste of time. It would be better to, and given the money that's available within the SAM3, you can actually afford to reseed in a comprehensive manner. But if you are overseeding, you've got to control any problem weeds in the previous 12 months, and bear in mind that you after using some selective herbicides, you have an exclusion period, and you've got to be very careful. Some of the best herbicides available have a significant period where and after you cannot sow things, and particularly some of these minor species and clovers. So that's something to bear in mind. Seed soil contact is absolutely paramount. So I would always rather use a drill, preferably a disc drill, but a drill that doesn't disturb too much ground, because what I have found in the recent past is we're often stirring up problems with the drill, as you know, with a tine drill sort of thing. So you can, post a hard grazing or a cut, savage something with some harrows, but it also favours establishment or re-establishment of rough stalk meadowgrass, buttercups, spear thistles, docks, dandelions. So a disc drill just slicing into the ground in the right conditions is a better starting point, I believe. If people reduce competition from the existing sward, you've got to understand there's the competition on top, but there's a massive underground competition, networks of roots that your little seedling is trying to develop its sort of feeding mechanism into. There are people who would use a low rate of glyphosate. If you are using glyphosate, you've got to make sure that foliage is removed before any seedling emerges and touches it. Since it became rainfast a couple of decades ago, that's problematic. Time of year is important. It's got to be warm enough and enough moisture about. And you can graze after sowing for good 10 days. Nothing's going to be damaged in that period. So other things to consider: protecting from pests. So that might be slugs in the slot, leather jackets in the spring, fruit fly in the autumn, and you've got to protect the seedling from the grazing animal. So sheep don't want to be near it for about 60 days or more.
It always feels like it's a battle.
It is. We often talk about the amazing soil biology and the complexity of bugs and beasts and fungi and bacteria in the soil. Well, the other thing that's in there is this an amazing network of highly successful species that we'd rather not have in our pastures, that are strangling everything. So everybody can point you towards an amazing thing that they saw that worked, but I've sold a lot of seed that has come to naught, and is as big a disappointment to me as to the farmer concerned. So I think we at the moment they've got some money that allows them to do this and not have to worry about getting a return on that money necessarily, because someone's going to pay them some money. However, if you get that money and you get a successful establishment of stuff, it's like Christmas, and that's what I'd like to encourage.
There was other triggering worms for Nick in that. I'm winding her up, which is glyphosate, ploughing, cultivation, pesticides, not pesticides, herbicides.
Liz, you're putting it that I'm the kind of you are ever more like that.
I know, but
now she's done her create course. She's all about.
But this is the area that I find some of it really difficult to understand. How you can try and you're trying to put a new seedling into a hostile environment.
Yeah.
And how do we do it in a way that isn't using the conventional thinking. And I'm not saying I'm being mean to Nick, but it's an area I struggle with to understand how you can do it with trying to reduce the amount of other things or interventions you have to do, because without some of them, you're not giving the seedlings the best opportunity. And so then you go, well, we just don't use new seeds. But as Francis alluded to, which that technology of nitrogen use sufficiency or clover yield are also useful to use in pasture-based systems. So it's just not a perfect solution, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
No. Well, we've done the direct drill herbal ley thing this season, haven't we, Francis? And it's stressed Reno out hugely because we've had to graze quite low early on, which has affected our kind of rotation. I can see things coming through. We would have had a far better take if we've just glyphosated the whole lot. It would have. Do you know what I mean? It would have been a much better take. But it's like a bit of a gamble. But I couldn't use glyphosate.
No, well, it's one of the options. I don't consider it anything other than. But if you are using it, you have to use it appropriately. I'm not a basis qualified agronomist, so I'd have to, allow other people to give the key recommendations there. But like if you graze with cattle, if you overseed or ideally drill, and then you shut up for 30 days for a light cut of silage, so you don't want to shade it out either. And you put cattle graze in a different way, and so you're going to be 30 days plus, should we say 20 days to give up to create a pasture that's appropriate for cattle grazing. That's 50 days, and you put cattle in, and the cattle actually aren't selectively grazing like sheep. But the other principle I would say is that I don't use the word. I try not to use the word regenerative. But the word is what I want to be. It seems to be being swamped by a whole lot of other things at the moment. But shallow plowing a field every 20 years is not environmentally destructive, I don't believe. It's quite a sensible way of having a clean start. I think maintaining pastures between times with direct drilling, or if you do say, I like to have a break crop. The arable farming rotations have got themselves into terrible problems with their, wheat, oilseed rape, blackgrass rotations. I think we've got ourselves in a bit of a problem on long-term pasture land, possibly as well, of not having a break crop that allows the, turf to break down and, naturally deal with the rough stalk meadowgrass and things like that accumulate in pasture, particularly the way we're punishing, the last 10 months have been hideous as far as field conditions for stock that is out on the ground. And not everybody can lock everything up indoors. And that doesn't necessarily help the makeup of the pasture from that key business objective of yield utilization and nutrient quality. And so you can use that break crop as something that you can possibly abuse during a winter period, and then have a fresh, clean start without necessarily use of herbicides. And so I think I like to think that, what our grandfathers did fundamentally was quite sustainable. I think we've probably, in the last couple of generations, messed an awful lot up. There's much less for the pollinators and the wider flora and fauna, and we need to create room for that. And there's no reason why we can't create room for that in our pastures. But we do need a clean start to be able to effectively establish those species.
So a question for both of you. Liz, the grazing guru, Francis, the seed man. So if I'm, say, a beef and sheep farmer and I've never done any herbal leys at all, and I'm thinking I need to, well, I partly need, I'd like to have a go at it, and I also need to replace some of my BPS. What information, what advice would you give that person?
So, well, in terms of it would be lots and lots of questions in terms of what that field, the proportion of land they're thinking about, soil type, situation, where is that field, what's its main usage, is it silage, is it mainly grazing, and then what infrastructure's there. So that, as Francis has also talked about, the key thing is, which is if you're going to put one in, you've got to think about how we rotate animals through it or give it rest periods. So it doesn't have to necessarily be subdivided, but we need an area where they can move off that field to another one. So it's also thinking about how it fits into the wider pattern. But the key consideration for me is also where are they going to go during the winter. So we're generally working that these are available from mid-spring, depending on how you looked after it the following autumn, through to mid-autumn, depending on also how you deferred it. So, and part of also that selection is how comfortable they are with it looking a bit messy, because it will. And so some people, that is a major concern in those first few years.
Okay.
I'm not sure I gave any advice, but those are the sort of questions.
But it's not just you've got to really think about, it's not just flipping at, I need some income coming in. I know I'll do this option, which I guess, Francis, is what you're getting quite a few inquiries from.
Yeah. It's I totally agree with Liz. It's a system, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that far adrift from what you're doing now, but you do need that infrastructure. You do need to keep off them during the winter, but somehow you need to create a clean start, because but most farms have some kind of rotational aspect to what they're doing, and therefore there is opportunity to plant things afresh. But if you've got permanent pasture, it's going to be difficult to know exactly where to start to create the diverse pasture that is productive under your system.
And some of that is if people, and that depends on whether they're chasing schemes or not, but generally what we can do a lot with grazing, we can do a lot by grazing those permanent pastures differently. Before we get too excited about turning everything over. So until we've managed those differently for at least a season, and there's still no shift in those species, and we know the nutrients are right and cycling, and they're still not doing anything, then we get excited. But that doesn't fit in your 12-month SFI agreement, does it? You can't do all of that exploration because I've decided I'm putting this field in and I've got to do it in the next 12 months. So that's some of it, is that the strategic thinking that needs to occur isn't happening in the right time frame for the schemes.
I totally agree with that. I think I know farms where just by going from a sort of set stocking regime over to a well-designed rotational infrastructure, their productivity, and a bit of lime maybe, and some other inputs in that respect, but it started to work for itself. White clover, key species for me, and I could never work out why it wasn't encouraged in the stewardship agreements in the past. It was always anything but white clover, but unless you give it a break, it doesn't survive. So it doesn't thrive, and it can't drive the system. So the system is more important than the seeds.
And I think, and it's the complexity of a grazing system that isn't being encouraged in some of those options. That is why at the moment my conversations are SFI and how to manage it, and and sort of discussing whether it's a SAM3 or whether it's a clover grass type ley that they're heading towards, and also thistles. That's probably 80% of my conversations at the moment. And so, and quite a lot of that is linked to how we're managing paddocks, nutrients, all of that stuff. So they're just an indicator of something wider.
I think the first subdivision fence that you put in, it has the biggest gearing towards improving things. But yes, I encourage people to look at the options that might allow them to spend on fencing and hedging and that kind of infrastructure, because in the long term, they then have something that can be managed.
And how have you found it, Francis, with this massive boom in seed sales? Because I'm thinking, on one hand, it's great for business. On the other hand, job satisfaction probably very poor.
I'm being very selective. To a certain extent, walking away from where it's just box ticking, because I'm more interested in the long term. And but in fairness, most of the people I work with nowadays are people who are interested in the longer term. There's lots of trade for other people, and it's been a feeding frenzy, and there's hardly enough seed, and some things will run out this August, September, I'm sure. We already don't have access to all the red clover varieties that we would like to, because the whole world wants red clover, and the production of it is very unreliable, and the last 2 or 3 years in Europe have been just horrendous. So I'm doing some work for one plant breeding company on the basis they don't have to pay me, they just have to make sure I have 5 tons of red clover of a certain variety next year.
It's like a dodgy drug deal.
It's more important than drugs, I tell you.
Do you meet in a lay-by somewhere?
We have done, yeah. But it takes a long time. We've talked about earlier on about breeding grass. It takes an awful long time. It takes 3 years to produce a crop of a perennial species, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not very rewarding necessarily for the growers, because the farmers who want to buy the seed don't want to pay more than a certain amount. I've been known to pay for the cocksfoot I want that sheep eat. I've paid twice as much as I could buy cocksfoot for, because I only want cocksfoot that sheep will eat. And the difference in the best technology you can imagine with growing things that are good seed producers are things that throw up heads that aren't necessarily entirely in line with pasture efficiency. But if they produce loads of seed, they produce cheap seed. So quite a lot of grass varieties at the tech end of it. So, I use a lot of Aberystwyth grass, but I'm not that sort of tied up with the sugar story. I think that's it's interesting, but it's not entirely relevant. What I like is persistence and high cell wall digestibility, and very manageable grasses which remain leafy over a longer period of time. Because actually managing grass is quite a challenge unless you've developed a good system. And we all know people who are brilliant at measuring and managing their grass and utilizing it incredibly efficiently. And they're the guys who can exploit this sort of genetic potential, but even they get more, I believe, out of slightly more interesting mixtures, and certainly out of clover.
And the one thing we did touch upon it, but in terms of nitrogen. So I went to a farm the other day and did a meeting, and they were using 250 kilos of nitrogen on a beef farm. And there was this like sharp intake of breath from the audience.
Yeah.
Because you just, on beef farms, you don't see many that are using that number, but between his stocking rate and performance, and it's £2,000 a hectare gross margin, so he's making it work for him. But it's that swing from, we don't need to use that amount, but if we do, that's potentially okay. But actually, we can do a huge amount with clovers, raising things differently. Herbal or diverse pastures can help reduce, if not eliminate, nitrogen use or artificial nitrogen use. Sorry.
I'd agree entirely with that, in that I've got a spring block calving dairy customer in the North Midlands, and they're down to about 50 or 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and increasing levels of clover. No particular cutback in production, having been at sort of 200 kilograms.
Just some of it is bravery. It's
drugs. It's another drug, isn't it? On some farms it's more difficult than others. And you think of a farm that's been in dairy farming for decades and has had very high levels of slurry and fertilizer put on it. That is not ground that clover is going to take very. It's just it's nearly impossible to establish reasonable levels of clover in those situations. And this other dairy that I'm sort of thinking about, and is one of the SFI pilot farms, which is makes it particularly interesting, because he's doing exactly what they would like us to be doing. All the right thinking people within DEFRA and RPA who are running this scheme want people to be doing what this business is doing, and they are making more money. But more importantly, if you're getting onto your carbon measuring side of things, if you're using 250 kilograms of nitrogen, that's knocking a big hole in your efficiency as far as that element of environmental measurement is concerned.
Yeah, and it's the leave between that as an objective that it isn't high enough in that business yet to adjust it.
Yeah, and there's some people doing amazing stuff, and I think it's quite important to me, like this particular. There was supposed to be a meeting on the farm this week, but it was postponed because of the elections. Would you believe? So, but what he's doing is something that you could show 90% of farmers, and they would start taking steps on that journey. I think that is, I'm more interested in getting more people to go down a greener route. I learn from the more extreme ends of things, but some of it is just not that what they're going to move towards, but changing a bit what they do and how they do it is potentially got a lot of environmental leverage nationally and economic efficiency for those businesses, because that is absolutely paramount. And I don't see that the environmental they're not mutually exclusive. Improving your environment and your productivity financially is they're not necessarily antagonistic, but there is a sort of a feeling that I either do one or the other.
Francis, last question from me. This has been great. How much do you, this is a very meek, Liz would never ask a question like this. how much do you enjoy your job, and what's your favorite bit of your job?
I enjoy everything bar the administration of my job. In that, as a one-man band, I do all the paperwork as well. And I find that a bit dull, but I can look at the end of the month and push a button, and I've had a clear run at the month, and I've made some money. But essentially, the satisfaction I get out of seeing an amazing field of pasture that is extremely productive and looks like it's going to last for 10 years, because I know then that I've been part of doing a good job.
And the environmental side of it, does that float your boat?
Oh, it's absolutely part of it. It's not mutually exclusive, because those pastures are not going to be straight perennial ryegrass.
Yeah. Okay.
But if I'm not helping someone's bottom line, I shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
And my final question is, if we needed to bank 5 tons of seed in the next few years, what would we go for? What's the up and coming variety? Do we need to buy it now?
Well, I think at the moment, red clover, but that may be just the way it is at the moment. But it's been like that for years. So the best red clover, the most persistent red clover varieties, there's the well-known Aber Claret, but I can assure you there are others that are as good. But there is some perennial red clover coming along, but I fear I might have retired before it gets to market. So that is not as productive as the conventional red clovers we use today, but more productive than white clover and stoloniferous. And it's naturally occurring in pastures, certainly up and down the Welsh borders, I see it. And there's some selections of that coming from, I think, both Aberystwyth and a couple of other places. And otherwise, because you only asked for one and I'm giving you more, but I'm interested in developments in cocksfoot and particularly softleaf tall fescue for the drier parts of the UK. Heat resilient, much more heat resilient than perennial ryegrass, and way more productive, but grazing management needs to be evolved.
Yeah, and we didn't get on in terms of the shorter intervals at times. It's just to stop it going very long.
Yeah, you beast them. Basically, you beast them in May to mid-June, and then particularly the best cocksfoots go vegetative at that point, way earlier than perennial ryegrass. So they're more palatable in July and August than perennial ryegrass, which is a time of year when actually palatability is very important.
It's always a joy, Francis. I've known you for far too many years, and we can geek out on grass quite a lot.
Sad, very sad, yeah.
And the reason why he mainly agreed with what I said is normally because I've learned quite a lot from him.
I sort of slightly vice versa, Liz.
So
it's been great. It's been a great chat. Thank you for listening to the ReGen Ag podcast. Huge thanks to our sponsor Tim Nicholson from Cactus Tree Guards, Reno for the music, and Pete Ord, the podcast wizard from the studio at Sunbeams, part of the Annie Mawson Sunbeams Music Trust. See you next time.